Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab U Movement and Performance Therapy. I want to talk to you a little bit about some go-to tests for lumbopelvic hip function, useful for determining deadlift and squat capability. So essentially, lumbopelvic hip function, to define it really easily and really briefly, is the timing that occurs, the function that occurs in the hips, pelvis, and lumbar spine. Okay, so what this helps tell you is whether people have good dissociation, because when we're squatting and deadlifting, we need to dissociate the movement at the hips, the movement at the pelvis, the movement at the lumbar spine. We want a stable lumbar spine, stable pelvis, but our hips are moving into flexion and extension. So we need the ability to dissociate that stuff. And I find that to be really important because sometimes we're trying to get people to prevent movement that they don't even understand. So how do you prevent something that you don't understand? If you don't know what elbow flexion is, how can I tell you don't flex your elbow? You don't even have access to that movement. So really it's a basic way to look at function at a fundamental level so that you can know what your person's capability is going to be like for learning proper squats and deadlifts if you're working with a beginner, or fixing squats and deadlifts if you're working with someone who's now developed some sort of pain syndrome, or fixing squats and deadlift for someone who's reached a plateau as far as their performance goes. Okay, so how do I make someone optimal? So two go-to tests that I use are very simple. I'm going to have Frank stand here in front of me, feet together. And what he's going to do, and we're going to want to get a side view here, is I'm just going to get him to bend over, nice and relaxed, and touch the toes, and nice and relaxed. So what we're trying to see in this multi-segmental flexion test is, does he get a uniform curve? Do the hips tilt forward? Okay, does he get that anterior pelvic tilt? Do the hips shoot back a little? Come on back up for me, Frank. And then back down again, nice and slow. Okay, and back up again. So you see that instinctively, he doesn't let the hips hinge back a lot. If I tell him, let your hips hinge back a little bit more, then he's gonna get that nicer anterior tilt and lumbar curve. Good. So multi-segmental flexion will give you an idea of whether that pelvis moves properly and how they move when they do the forward flexion. Do they let the hips shift back? If they don't let the hips shift back, is it because the pelvis is posteriorly tilted? Okay, and then do we need to work on accessing more anterior tilt? And there's some other tests that you can do for that as well. You also want to see, does the lumbar spine get some flexion, or are they apprehensive about flexion? Now, the other test is the opposite. So now he's going to go multi-segmental extension. So he's going to raise the arms up and reach back as far as he can, and again, keeping the knees extended. And as we can see, he lets the hips come forward a little bit, and you can come back out of there slightly because it's probably not super comfortable. So what we're trying to see, so the main things here is normally the ASIS, so my anterior superior iliac spine, should shift to my toes, okay? And the spine of the scapula in the back over here should pass my heels. So I should get at least that much extension. Okay, another thing I want to look at, go ahead again, Frank, is do I get nice thoracic extension? Okay, because I need good thoracic extension for squats and deadlifts. So do I get nice thoracic extension? Do I also get lumbar spine extension? So he's pretty good here. Good, you can come back out of there. So why are these important screens? For one, and it's also important when you look at posture, but for one, if you have someone who doesn't have good lumbar spine extension, that may limit their capability for deadlifts a little bit more, okay? Because as I was saying before, if you want to control movement, you have to understand what the movement is. So if I need you to limit lumbar flexion, as in you're deadlifting and I don't want the lumbar spine to flex, so you need to create extension to prevent it from flexing, but you don't have good extension range of motion, it's going to be harder for you to resist flexion under load. Okay, so someone who has a posteriorly tilted pelvis, who doesn't have good extension, or someone who stays always extended, so if he comes and does his forward bending and he didn't get his nice curve, let's say his lumbar spine stayed really extended and then he would get flexion only in his thoracic spine, it's going to be harder for him to have good deadlift mechanics. You can come back up, and you may use different cues with him. So someone who doesn't have good extension range of motion may benefit from a extend and lift the chest up cue, but someone who had the opposite, a lot of extension range of motion and lives in extension, probably would go and get too much extension from their lower back if you use that cue. So all of that gives you an idea of what their basic capacity is or how they move initially. So again, as I was saying, these tests would be used in conjunction with a whole bunch of other tests. We want to look at lumbopelvic dissociation. We want to look at, are there soft tissue issues that might prevent capability or capacity? But the important thing is these are fundamental tests on how the lumbar spine and hips should move naturally. And if you don't have the natural movement, it becomes more difficult for you to limit the movement when you go into lifting. So fundamentals for me are, does it move like it should when I'm not loaded? Because when I'm loading it, I want to limit that movement. I want to control that movement. I can't control movement that I don't understand or don't have. Okay, so fundamentals, does it work properly? Where are the limitations? And how is that going to help me cue my person to what I need them to do in a loaded deadlift or squat position?